He gave up everything to care for his grandma, but he had a secret plan. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The world of 68-year-old Flena Hernandez crumbled like a sandcastle against a rising tide. One moment she was reaching for her favorite teacup on the top shelf, and the next the kitchen floor came rushing toward her with terrifying speed. When she woke in the hospital, the left side of her body refused to obey her commands, and words slurred in her mouth like marbles. The stroke had been severe, the doctor explained with practiced sympathy, as if saying the words often enough had worn down their sharp edges. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, his clipboard a shield against the raw emotion in the room. "But you'll need substantial care moving forward. Living alone is no longer an option." Flena's colonial-style house in Seabrook, Massachusetts, had been her sanctuary for 47 years. The thought of abandoning its weathered shingles, creaking floorboards, and ocean views that changed with the seasons sent a pain through her, chest more acute than any physical ailment. The assisted living facility brochures her children left on her bedside table remained untouched, silent harbingers of an unwanted future. Her 3 children visited in shifts, each staying just long enough to demonstrate concern without disrupting their busy lives. Martin flew in from Chicago, spent 2 days arranging her finances, then returned to his law practice. Carla came from Denver with a list of senior communities already researched, and Paula called from Seattle, unable to leave her surgical residency, but promising to help financially. None of them could uproot their lives to care for her. They spoke in hushed tones in the hospital corridor, weighing options that all seemed to end with Flena being extracted from the only place she still felt connected to her late husband, Gregory. On the 5th day after her stroke, while Flena was learning to manipulate a spoon with her uncooperative right hand, a tall figure appeared in the doorway of her hospital room. Fritz, her grandson, Paula's boy. His lanky frame seemed too large for the sterile space, his dark curls and 5 o'clock shadow a stark contrast to the clinical whiteness surrounding them. "Grandma," he said simply, pulling a chair to her bedside and taking her functioning hand in both of his. His architect's hands, strong, precise, with a small ink stain on the right index finger. At 32, he still had the habit of doodling building designs on any available surface. "Everyone's panicking about what to do," he continued, his voice low and intimate. "But I have a solution. I'm moving in with you." Flena tried to protest, the words catching in her throat like fish bones, but Fritz continued with the confidence that had always marked his character. "My lease is up next month anyway. The design firm I was working for just folded. Boston's architectural market is oversaturated." He squeezed her hand. "Think of it this way. You need someone, and I need time to regroup professionally. It's perfect timing." What he didn't mention was the argument he'd had with his mother the night before. How Paula had questioned his motives, reminding him that Grandma Flena's beachfront property alone was worth over $1 million, not counting Gregory's meticulously maintained antique collection and her considerable savings. "This isn't about the inheritance," he had insisted. But Paula's knowing look suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, and perhaps she was right to be suspicious. As Fritz sat by his grandmother's hospital bed, watching her struggle with the simple act of drinking water, calculations ran through his mind. 6 months, maybe a year of caregiving, building a relationship that would ensure his position in her will. After his professional humiliation when Miller and Associates collapsed, taking his designs and reputation with it, this opportunity offered a financial safety net he desperately needed. But watching Flena's frustration as water dribbled down her chin, Fritz felt a momentary flicker of doubt. He gently wiped her face with a napkin, suddenly remembering how she had done the same for him during childhood summers spent at her house, cleaning sticky ice cream from his cheeks. "I know it's not ideal," he admitted both to her and himself, "but we'll figure it out together, I promise." A single tear escaped Flena's eye, traveling slowly down her wrinkled cheek. Whether from gratitude or grief, Fritz couldn't tell. But as he helped her settle back against the pillows, he silently reminded himself that good intentions and selfish ones weren't mutually exclusive. He could help his grandmother and help himself. Everyone would win. He couldn't have known then how profoundly wrong and right he would prove to be. 3 weeks later, Fritsch stood in the center of Flena's kitchen, surrounded by boxes of medical supplies, prescription bottles, and adaptive equipment. The charming colonial house that had seemed so idyllic in his childhood memories now revealed itself as a labyrinth of narrow doorways, uneven floors, and stairs that might as well have been mountains. The physical therapist who had visited that morning had left behind a list of necessary modifications that made Fritsch's head spin: widened doorways, grab bars, a stair lift. His architectural training told him these changes would forever alter the home's historical character. Flena sat in her new wheelchair by the bay window overlooking the Atlantic, her gaze fixed on the horizon where water met sky. Her silence was more unnerving than her earlier outbursts had been. "The home health aide will start tomorrow," Fritsch said, attempting to sound upbeat as he unpacked a shower chair. "She'll come 3 times a week to help with bathing and exercises." "Don't want strangers," Flena muttered, the words slightly slurred but comprehensible. Her speech had improved with therapy, but frustration often caused her to retreat into silence. "We talked about this, Grandma. I can't do everything myself." He immediately regretted the edge in his voice. 2 weeks of sleepless nights, learning to transfer her from bed to chair, preparing meals that met her dietary restrictions, and administering medications on a strict schedule had frayed his patience to breaking point. "Go back to Boston, then," she snapped, and for a moment her old fire returned. "Didn't ask you to come." The truth of her statement stung more than he expected. He had arrived as a savior, expecting gratitude, perhaps even some acknowledgement of his sacrifice. Instead, he'd found a proud woman humiliated by her limitations and determined to push away anyone who witnessed her vulnerability. Last night, after helping her to bed, he'd retreated to the guest room, now his room, and researched assisted living facilities in the area. The monthly costs were astronomical, and most had waiting lists anyway. Even if she agreed to go, which she wouldn't, they were looking at a minimum 6-month wait. He'd checked his calendar, calculating exactly how long until her 6-month medical reassessment, clinging to the hope that she might regain enough independence by then to no longer need his constant supervision. A sharp knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find a petite woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked black hair and a covered dish in her hands. "I'm Vera Mullins from next door," she announced without preamble. "I've brought lasagna. Flena hates hospital food, so I figure she could use some real cooking." She thrust the dish into his hands and stepped past him into the house with the confidence of someone who had done so countless times before. "Flena Hernandez," Vera called out as she entered the living room. "Stop scowling at the ocean and say hello to an old friend." To Fritsch's amazement, his grandmother's face softened. "About time you showed up," she replied with the ghost of a smile. "Been giving the young fellow a hard time, I see." Vera nodded toward Fritsch. "Your grandson, right? Paula's boy?" "Fritsch," he supplied, following with the lasagna. "Architect, currently unemployed babysitter." "Humph," Flena grunted, but without real anger. Vera turned to him with shrewd eyes. "Tuesday is card day, 2 o'clock. The girls will be here as usual." "Card day," Fritsch echoed. 43 years every Tuesday," Vera explained. "4 of us. Not stopping because of a little stroke." She patted Flena's shoulder. "We'll set up in the sunroom. Just need card tables and those folding chairs from the basement." "I'm not." "Sure, that's a good idea," Fritsch began, thinking of Flena's fatigue, her medication schedule, her difficulty communicating. "Wasn't asking permission," Vera replied cheerfully. "See you Tuesday, Flena. Don't let this one bubble wrap you." She departed as abruptly as she had arrived, leaving behind the scent of tomato sauce and a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Flena turned to Fritsch with unexpected clarity in her eyes. "Better clean the sunroom," she said, and for the first time since the stroke, she seemed more like the grandmother he remembered. That night, as Fritsch heated Vera's lasagna for dinner, a notification lit up his phone. His former colleague from Miller and Associates had landed a position at a prestigious Boston firm. The accompanying photo showed a sleek high-rise lobby with soaring ceilings and walls of glass, exactly the kind of project Fritsch had dreamed of designing. Meanwhile, he was researching wheelchair-accessible bathroom renovations and trying to decipher Medicare paperwork. As he served dinner, watching Flena struggle to manipulate her adaptive silverware, resentment welled up inside him. She chewed methodically, occasionally missing her mouth, requiring him to wipe her chin. His career was slipping away with each passing day, his professional connections growing cold while his peers advanced without him. Later, as he helped her prepare for bed, a routine that still felt invasive for both of them, she suddenly gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Not what you expected," she said, her eyes sharp with understanding. "It's fine," he lied, adjusting her pillow. "Not fine," she countered. "Hard. No, it's hard." Before he could respond, she released his wrist and turned away, signaling the end of the conversation. Fritsch stood in the doorway, watching her small form under the quilt, suddenly reminded of her humanity beyond her role as his grandmother or his potential benefactor. The realization was uncomfortable, complicating the narrative he'd constructed to justify his presence here. As he turned off the light, he calculated once more. 24 weeks until her medical reassessment. 24 weeks of his life, suspended in this limbo of caregiving. 24 weeks to secure his future. If you're enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. Tuesday arrived with a coastal fog that wrapped the old colonial in ghostly white muffling sounds and blurring boundaries. Fritsch spent the morning cleaning the sunroom as instructed, discovering furniture arrangements that accommodated Flena's wheelchair while preserving the room's charm. His architectural training proved unexpectedly useful as he considered sightlines, circulation patterns, and accessibility. By noon, the space was transformed. The antique card table positioned near the windows, chairs arranged to facilitate conversation, side tables within reach for refreshments. Flena observed his work from the doorway, offering terse directions that Fritsch found himself following without argument. This new dynamic, Flena as client, Fritsch as designer, provided a respite from the more intimate and challenging aspects of caregiving. At precisely 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. Vera arrived first, carrying a tray of lemon bars. She assessed the room with an approving nod. "Not bad, architect. You followed instructions." 2 more women arrived in quick succession. Harriet Donovan, a tall, elegant woman in her 70s with perfectly coiffed white hair and a walking cane she clearly used more for emphasis than support, brought a thermos of Earl Grey tea. Following her was Tofia Jenkins, slight and bird-like, with penetrating grey eyes behind round spectacles, carrying well-worn playing cards in a wooden box. "So you're the grandson," Harriet said, studying Fritsch with undisguised curiosity. "Daniel's boy." "Paula's," he corrected. "I'm Fritsch." "Architect," Flena added from her wheelchair with what might have been pride. "Temporarily between projects," Fritsch clarified, conscious of how his professional identity had become increasingly important to him since losing it. "Retired literature professor," Tofia introduced herself. 34 years at Coastal Atlantic University. Still teach 1 seminar each spring." Her voice was melodious but direct, her gaze analytical. "You've made good adjustments to the space." "The house needs work," Fritsch admitted. "It wasn't designed with accessibility in mind." "Few things are," Tofia replied. "Most of life involves adapting spaces never intended for us." Before Fritsch could ponder this philosophical turn, Vera clapped her hands. "Enough chit-chat. Are we playing cards or hosting a symposium?" Fritsch retreated to the kitchen, ostensibly to prepare a tray of refreshments, but in reality seeking escape from the quartet's intimidating energy. Through the open door he heard the shuffling of cards and observed a transformation in his grandmother. Within the familiar ritual of the game and the company of old friends, Flena's speech grew more fluid, her movements more confident. She arranged her cards awkwardly with her functioning hand, but refused offers of assistance. "Been playing together since 1981, Harriet explained, when Fritsch delivered the refreshments. "Started when our children were in school together." "That's over 40 years, Fritsch remarked, impressed by the longevity of their friendship. Your mathematical skills are impeccable, Tofia observed dryly. Will you join us? We could teach you Oklahoma gin. Another time, Fritsch declined. I have some work to do. This was a half-truth. He planned to update his portfolio in hopes of remote freelance opportunities, but mostly he wanted to avoid intrusion into what was clearly Flena's territory. As he turned to leave, Tofia's voice stopped him. Your grandmother tells us you're staying indefinitely. Something in her tone, a hint of skepticism perhaps, made him turn back. As long as she needs me. Very commendable, she replied. Few young people would make such a sacrifice for family these days. It's not entirely selfless, Fritsch found himself admitting. I needed a change of scenery after my firm collapsed. How convenient that your grandmother's stroke provided one. Tofia's eyes never left his face, her expression pleasantly neutral, despite the implied accusation. Tofia, Harriet murmured, a gentle rebuke. Leave the boy alone, Vera added, dealing cards with practiced efficiency. Not everyone has ulterior motives. But in the momentary silence that followed, Fritsch felt exposed, as if Tofia had glimpsed something in him that he preferred to keep hidden, even from himself. He excused himself and retreated to the small bedroom that still felt like a guest room despite his clothes hanging in the closet and his laptop permanently set up on the desk. Later that afternoon, while the card game continued, Fritsch searched online for contractors specializing in accessibility modifications. The estimates were staggering. $30,000 for the bathroom alone, another $15,000 for the stairlift. Insurance would cover some medical equipment, but not structural changes. How much of Flena's savings should be directed toward renovations to a house that would eventually be sold? The question made him uncomfortable. Who was he to make these financial decisions? But as her primary caregiver and the only family member on site, these choices were increasingly falling to him. He needed to understand Flena's financial situation better if he was going to help manage it. At least that's what he told himself as he contemplated searching for her financial documents. When the card group departed in the late afternoon, Fritsch found Flena exhausted but animated, her eyes brighter than they had been in weeks. Good day, he asked, helping her from the sunroom to the living room sofa. Best since hospital, she confirmed. Then, with a directness that caught him off guard, Tofia thinks you're after my money. Fritsch nearly dropped the footstool he was positioning. What? Always suspicious, that one, taught critical theory. Flena waved her functioning hand dismissively. Sees ulterior motives everywhere. Fritsch struggled to formulate a response that wasn't defensive. And what do you think? Flena studied him, her head tilted slightly. Think you're lost, looking for anchor. The simple assessment struck uncomfortably close to truth. Before he could respond, she continued, Money's not what you think. House needs work, roof leaks in West Corner. I noticed, Fritsch said, recalling the water stain in the upstairs hallway. I can call someone to look at it. Flena nodded, then changed the subject. Need help upstairs closet, want photo albums. The request surprised him. Since his arrival, Flena had shown little interest in activities beyond the necessary routines of daily life. Any particular album? Blue ones, Gregory's fishing trips. A shadow passed over her face at the mention of her late husband. Miss Water. Haven't seen ocean up close since stroke. Fritsch glanced out the window at the beach visible from their property, just beyond the weathered wooden fence that marked the boundary of Flena's yard. It was early March, the wind still carrying winter's bite, but the path to the shore was short and could probably accommodate the wheelchair with some assistance. Would you like to go down to the beach? He offered, impulsively. Not today, it's too late and cold, but tomorrow if the weather's good. Flena's expression shifted, hope and fear battling across her features. Too difficult. I'm an architect, Fritsch reminded her with more confidence than he felt. Solving spatial problems is what I do. Let me figure it out. That evening, after helping Flena to bed, Fritsch retrieved the blue photo albums from the upstairs closet as requested. Unable to resist, he opened the first one, finding himself drawn into a visual history of his grandfather. A man who had died when Fritsch was only 10, leaving impressions more than memories. The photos showed Gregory Gernandez in his element, on boats of various sizes, often with impressive catches displayed. Some images included a much younger Flena, her hair dark and wild in the sea breeze, her smile uninhibited in a way Fritsch had never witnessed. In others, Gregory stood with local fishermen, or beside what appeared to be community groups gathered on the beach. One photo in particular caught his attention, Gregory and Flena standing before a crowd, holding a banner that read, "Save our shores." The couple looked fierce and determined, nothing like the conventional grandparents Fritsch had known in his childhood visits. Intrigued, he continued turning pages, watching as the environmental activism documented in the early albums gradually gave way to family photos, Flena's children growing up, then grandchildren appearing. He found several of himself as a child, building elaborate sandcastles under Flena's supervision. In one, his 10-year-old self proudly displayed a blueprint-like drawing of a beach house, while Flena looked on with evident pride. The memory returned with surprising clarity. He had announced his intention to become an architect that summer, inspired by helping Gregory repair the back porch. "You have good hands," his grandfather had told him, "and a good eye. You see how things fit together." Fritsch closed the album, suddenly aware of how little he knew about his grandparents' lives before they became grandparents. Tomorrow, he would take the albums to Flena as promised. But first, he would explore the attic in search of more clues about the woman he had committed to caring for, and perhaps in the process discover something about the inheritance he secretly coveted. The attic was a time capsule of carefully preserved memories. Fritsch spent the morning navigating narrow passages between stacked trunks, labeled boxes, and furniture shrouded in bedsheets. He had come with the practical purpose of measuring the space for potential conversion into a bedroom for Flena, eliminating the need for a stair lift, but found himself increasingly distracted by the artifacts of her earlier life. A steamer trunk contained carefully folded clothing from the 1960s and 70s, flowing dresses with bold patterns, fringed vests, and even what appeared to be a protest uniform. Jeans and a hand-painted T-shirt reading, "People over Profit." Their smaller lockbox held pamphlets, newspaper clippings, and meeting minutes from an organization called Coastal Defenders Coalition. Most revealing were the journals, dozens of them, each covering approximately 1 year, written in Flena's neat, decisive handwriting. Fritsch knew he should close the worn leather covers and return them to their resting place, but curiosity overcame propriety. He selected one dated 1972 and began to read. The town council meeting was a disaster. Williams claims the chemical processing plant will bring jobs, but at what cost? Our water, our air, our beach, all sacrificed for corporate profit. Gregory says, "We need more than protests now. We need legal action. I've contacted the environmental law clinic at the university. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Must be prepared to fight a long battle." Fritsch flipped forward several pages. Petition has reached 500 signatures. The council is starting to listen, but Williams has powerful friends in the state legislature. Gregory received a threatening call yesterday, someone suggesting he might lose his teaching position if he continues making trouble. They underestimate what we're willing to sacrifice for this place. Further entries documented town meetings, legal strategies, and late-night planning sessions held in the very house where Fritsch now sat. He began to understand that the charming coastal town he remembered from childhood visits, with its protected shoreline, thriving local businesses, and strict building codes, was partly his grandparents' creation. Most surprising was the revelation of Flena's role. In these pages, she emerged not as a supporter of her husband's activism, but as a strategist and leader in her own right. Local newspaper clippings described her as the determined Mrs. Gernandez and the voice of the coastline. A black and white photograph showed her addressing a crowd from the steps of Town Hall, her posture radiating authority despite her small stature. Fritsch was so absorbed in his discoveries that he nearly missed the sound of the doorbell. Hastily, returning the journals to their box, he descended to find Tofia Jenkins standing on the porch, a book tucked under her arm. "Promise to lend this to Flena," she explained, handing him a worn hardcover on native coastal plantings. "Is she up for a visitor?" Fritsch hesitated, aware that his grandmother was having a difficult morning. Her physical therapy session had been particularly challenging, leaving her exhausted and irritable. "It's not the best time," he began. "I won't stay long," Tofia pressed, already stepping past him into the hallway with the same assurance Vera had displayed. "Sometimes difficult days are when we most need connection." Unable to argue without seeming overprotective, Fritsch led her to the living room where Flena sat in her wheelchair, gazing at the blue photo albums Fritsch had brought down that morning but had yet to open. "Tofia," Flena acknowledged, her expression softening slightly. "Brought the book on dune grasses," Tofia replied, settling into a chair opposite. "Thought it might interest you, given your history with coastal preservation." Fritsch positioned himself nearby, ostensibly organizing medical supplies, but actually curious about this reference to Flena's history. "Was just thinking about those days," Flena admitted, gesturing weakly toward the photo albums. "Feels like different lifetime." "Different person, perhaps," Tofia agreed. "But the coastline still stands protected because of decisions you made then." She turned to Fritsch. "Did you know your grandmother once chained herself to a bulldozer to prevent construction of an oil storage facility on the North Beach?" "I had no idea," Fritsch admitted, trying to reconcile this image with the proper grandmother who had taught him to set a formal dinner table and write thank-you notes. "Made newspaper," Flena confirmed, with a hint of pride. "Governor called personally to negotiate." "You were quite the radical," Tofia said fondly. "Still are in your way." Flena snorted, but her eyes crinkled with amusement. "Too old for chains now, can barely manage shoelaces." The self-deprecating humor was new, a sign that perhaps Flena was beginning to adapt to her changed circumstances. Tofia stayed for nearly an hour, the conversation moving from environmental activism to local gossip to book recommendations. Throughout, Fritsch observed his grandmother becoming increasingly animated, her speech more fluid, her gestures more natural. After Tofia departed, Fritsch brought lunch, simple sandwiches and soup, and found Flena paging slowly through one of the photo albums. "You were quite the crusader," he commented, setting down her meal. "Someone had to be," she replied without looking up. "Town was selling its soul bit by bit, becoming something else. Like what's happening in Boston now," Fritsch mused, thinking of the historic neighborhoods being transformed by luxury high-rises and chain stores. "My last project before the firm collapsed was converting an old cotton mill into premium apartments. We kept the brick exterior but gutted everything inside, called it heritage preservation in the marketing materials." He hadn't meant to reveal so much, but Flena's eyes lifted to his with unexpected understanding. "Compromise?" "More than I was comfortable with," he admitted. "But that's how it works in big firms. You execute the vision, even when it's not your own." Flena nodded, turning back to her album. "Why I fought hardest for zoning laws, harder to destroy what's protected." The conversation might have continued, but Flena's medication schedule interrupted. After lunch, she needed rest, and Fritsch retreated to his makeshift office in the sunroom to continue his job search. He sent out 3 applications for remote consulting positions, but received automatic replies suggesting long review periods. His savings were dwindling, and the small stipend Paula had arranged to help with Flena's care barely covered groceries and medical supplies. That evening, while preparing dinner, Fritsch noticed a leak in the kitchen ceiling, a slow drip that splattered rhythmically into a pot he'd positioned to catch it. The roof repair couldn't wait much longer, but who would pay for it? How much of Flena's savings should be directed toward home maintenance? These were questions he would need to address soon, preferably with his mother and uncle involved in the decision. As he helped Flena eat her dinner, baked fish with vegetables, foods that required minimal cutting and were easy to manage with her adaptive utensils, he found himself studying her face, searching for traces of the fierce activist from the photographs. "Found my journals, didn't you?" she asked suddenly, catching him off guard. "I was measuring the attic," he began defensively, "for possible conversion to a bedroom, and reading my private writings." There was no anger in her tone, only a wry acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," Fritsch said, meaning it. I was curious about me before stroke or me before grandmother. A slight smile played at the corner of her mouth. Both, I guess. I didn't know about your environmental work. Not work, life. She set down her fork with deliberate precision. What we do becomes who we are, Fritsch. Remember that. The simplicity of her statement carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Before he could respond, she changed subjects with the abruptness he was coming to recognize as her way of controlling conversations when her speech limitations became frustrating. Beach tomorrow? You promised. Fritsch nodded, though privately. He worried about the logistics. If weather permits, I'll need to scout the path first. Been waiting, she reminded him, determination hardening her features. Need to see water again. That night, after settling Flena in bed, Fritsch returned to the attic. This time he bypassed the journals and photographs in favor of financial documents stored in a filing cabinet. Most were organized by year, with separate folders for taxes, investments, property and insurance policies. The picture that emerged was more complex than he had anticipated. Flena's assets were substantial, but not extravagant. The beachfront property was indeed valuable, but carried significant annual tax burdens. Gregory's antique collection had been partially liquidated over the years, with proceeds directed toward home repairs and medical expenses. The remaining savings, while comfortable, wouldn't sustain extensive renovations and long-term care simultaneously. More troubling was the discovery that the house needed considerable work beyond the roof repair. An inspection report from 2 years earlier listed foundation issues, electrical updates, and plumbing replacements that had been deferred. The projected costs would consume much of what Flena had left. Fritsch sat back on his heels, realization dawning. The inheritance he had imagined, the financial safety net he had counted on, was largely illusory. Unless the house was sold, the estate would barely cover Flena's care needs for the coming years. As he closed the filing cabinet and prepared to descend from the attic, his gaze fell on a small wooden chest he hadn't noticed earlier. Inside, he found not valuable jewelry or stock certificates, but a collection of activist badges, protest signs in miniature, and the original coastal protection petition that had saved the town's shoreline. A handwritten note attached to the EEG petition read, "The most valuable things we leave behind aren't possessions but actions that outlive us." For the first time since arriving, Fritsch questioned not just his motives, but his understanding of value itself. He had come seeking financial security, but was discovering something altogether different in this house by the sea. Tomorrow, he would take his grandmother to the beach as promised. And perhaps there, with the vastness of the ocean before them, he might begin to see beyond the limitations of his own ambition. Will Fritsch find a way to balance his career ambitions with his growing appreciation for his grandmother's values? And what will happen when he learns the full extent of Flena's financial situation? The journey of discovery has only just begun. Dawn broke clear and crisp, painting the coastal landscape in watercolor hues of pink and gold. Fritsch rose early, determined to fulfill his promise to Flena. Armed with a tape measure and notebook, he surveyed the path from the back porch to the beach, identifying obstacles and planning modifications. The terrain presented challenges. 3 wooden steps, down to the garden path, then a gentle but potentially treacherous slope of packed sand leading to the shore. By the time Flena awoke, Fritsch had assembled a makeshift solution, plywood boards to create temporary ramps over the steps, and a path of outdoor carpet runners to provide traction for the wheelchair across the sandy sections. It wasn't elegant, but it would serve the immediate purpose. "It won't be the smoothest ride," he warned as he helped Flena with her morning routine, washing, dressing, medications, "but I think we can make it work." Flena's eyes shone with anticipation, her movements more cooperative than usual. She allowed Fritsch to bundle her in layers, a warm sweater, then her late husband's oversized fishing jacket, a scarf, and finally a knitted cap pulled over her silver hair. The resulting figure looked less like the elegant grandmother of Fritsch's childhood and more like a sea captain prepared for changing weather. "Ready?" he asked, positioning the wheelchair at the back door. "Since stroke," she replied simply. The journey began awkwardly. The wheelchair bumped over the temporary ramps, causing Flenna to grip the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. The carpet runners shifted slightly under the wheels, requiring Fritsch to apply steady pressure to maintain their course. But as they cleared the garden and approached the natural dune line that separated property from public beach, a transformation came over Flenna. Her posture straightened, her breathing deepened, and her eyes fixed on the horizon with hungry intensity. "Stop here," she commanded as they reached the crest of the final dune. Before them stretched the Atlantic, vast and eternal, waves breaking rhythmically against the shore. The March wind carried salt and promise, tousling Fritsch's hair and bringing high color to Flenna's cheeks. For several minutes they remained in silence, bound by the shared experience of oceanic immensity. Fritsch found himself remembering childhood visits, how Gregory had taught him to read tide patterns, how Flenna had explained the difference between types of shells, how the three of them had spent hours building elaborate sand structures that inevitably surrendered to the advancing tide. "When I'm gone," Flenna said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been since the stroke, "remember this view belongs to everyone." Fritsch glanced down at her, struck by the unexpected statement. "You fought hard for it, worth every battle." She patted his hand where it rested on the wheelchair handle. "Take me closer." Navigating down the dune proved challenging, but Fritsch's determination matched Flenna's. When they finally reached the firmer sand near the waterline, he positioned the wheelchair to face the horizon and engaged the brakes. Then, understanding her unspoken desire, he removed her shoes and socks, rolled up her pant legs and helped her stand with his support. Together, they took 10 shaky steps toward the water's edge. The effort left Flenna breathless but triumphant, as the cold Atlantic foam swirled around her ankles and receded, leaving momentary footprints that vanished with the next wave. "Still here," she whispered, and Fritsch wasn't sure if she meant herself, the ocean, or some essential connection between the two. They remained until Flenna began to shiver, the excitement of the moment giving way to physical limitations. Fritsch gently guided her back to the wheelchair, dried her feet with a small towel he'd tucked into his pocket, and replaced her shoes and socks. The return journey to the house was easier, both of them buoyed by the success of their expedition. "We'll come again," Fritsch promised as he helped Flenna settle in the living room with a cup of hot tea. "Maybe create a more permanent path down to the beach." "Worth the effort," she agreed, her eyes still bright with the remembered vista. Like old times. That afternoon, while Flenna napped, Fritsch researched accessibility options for outdoor spaces. His architectural training, previously focused on sleek urban buildings, now found purpose in solving the practical challenge of connecting his grandmother to the landscape she loved. He sketched several options, calculating materials and costs, before realizing he was approaching the project with genuine enthusiasm rather than obligation. A call from his mother interrupted his work. Paula's voice carried the familiar undertone of guilt mixed with concern. "How's she doing?" Paula asked after perfunctory greetings. "Better today," Fritsch replied, surprised to find he meant it. "We made it down to the beach this morning." "You what?" Paula's shock was evident. "Is that safe?" "I made it safe," Fritsch explained, a hint of pride coloring his voice. "You should have seen her face when she touched the water, Mom. It was like something woke up inside her." The line went quiet for a moment before Paula responded. "That sounds wonderful. I'm glad you're there, Fritsch. I don't think any of us realized how important the ocean is to her." "There's a lot none of us realized," Fritsch said, thinking of the activist journals, the photographs, the wooden chest of memories. "She had quite a life before becoming our grandmother." "I suppose she did," Paula acknowledged, sounding slightly defensive. "It wasn't easy growing up with parents so dedicated to their causes. We moved a lot when Dad's teaching positions changed. Summers were never vacations. They were community organizing opportunities. I sometimes felt the coastline got more attention than I did." The revelation added another piece to the puzzle of Flenna. Fritsch had never considered how her passionate activism might have affected her children, creating both the independent, successful adults they'd become and the emotional distance that now characterized their family relationships. "Anyway," Paula continued, "that's not why I called. Martin and I have been discussing grandmother's finances. The house is going to need considerable work to make it suitable for her long term, and Medicare won't cover most of it. We're thinking it might be better to sell now, while property values are high, and use the proceeds for an assisted living facility with proper medical support. Fritsch felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. She doesn't want to leave her home. What she wants and what she needs might be different things, Paula replied with the pragmatic tone she'd developed through years of medical training. The house is her main asset. It makes financial sense to liquidate it sooner rather than later. 6 weeks ago, Fritsch would have agreed wholeheartedly. The logical strategy was obvious. Sell the valuable beachfront property, place Flena in professional care, and distribute the remaining assets among the family. Now, having witnessed Flena's profound connection to the house and its surroundings, the calculation seemed incomplete. "Let's not rush into anything," he suggested. "She's making progress with physical therapy, and I'm working on designs to make the house more accessible. At least give her the 6 months until her medical reassessment." "Since when did you become such an advocate for keeping old houses?" Paula asked, suspicious. "I seem to recall your firm specialized in gutting historic properties for luxury. Renovations." The barb struck closer to home than she could have known. "Maybe I'm learning to see the value in preservation," Fritsch countered, "in not destroying something meaningful just because it's inconvenient." The conversation ended with an uneasy truce. Paula would discuss the timeline with Martin, but the underlying tension remained. For the first time, Fritsch recognized that his position as Flena's in-house caregiver gave him a degree of influence over family decisions that his mother and uncle found unsettling. That evening, as he helped Flena prepare for bed, he found himself studying the familiar landscape of her face, the deep lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and determination, the firm set of her mouth that could transform instantly from stubbornness to surprising tenderness. "Mom called today," he mentioned, adjusting her pillow. "She and Uncle Martin are concerned about the house, the repairs, the modifications needed." Flena's eyes narrowed slightly. "Want to sell?" "They think it might be more practical," Fritsch admitted, "financially speaking." "And you?" The question was direct, her gaze unwavering despite her fatigue. Fritsch hesitated, caught between his earlier motivations and his evolving perspective. "I think this house is part of who you are. That should count for something in the equation." Flena nodded slowly, satisfied with his answer. Then, with unexpected clarity, "Top desk drawer, blue folder. Need to show you something." Curious, Fritsch retrieved the folder from the antique secretary desk in the corner of her bedroom. Inside, he found property deeds, insurance policies, and a detailed will executed just 2 years earlier. As he scanned the documents, his understanding of Flena's financial situation shifted once more. The house and property were not held in simple ownership, but had been placed in a conservation trust that Flena had established with Gregory before his death. Upon her passing, the land would be protected from development in perpetuity, with a life interest allowing her heirs to maintain the house for 20 years before it would be converted to an educational center for coastal ecology. "Not mine. To sell," Flena explained, watching his expression change as he absorbed the implications. "Not theirs either." "Does Mom know about this?" Fritsch asked, stunned by the sophisticated legal arrangement that effectively removed the property from consideration as a liquid asset. "Told them years ago, never listen." A shadow of frustration crossed her face. "Think I'm just old woman now, stroke victim. But papers still legal." Fritsch sat heavily in the chair beside her bed, the documents still open in his lap. The inheritance. He had imagined the financial safety net that had partly motivated his decision to become Flena's caregiver had never existed in the form he'd assumed. The realization should have been devastating, but instead he felt an unexpected lightness, as if a pretense he'd been maintaining had finally become unnecessary. "I'll explain it to them again," he promised. "Make sure they understand the legal structure." "Good." Flena's eyes began to close, the day's exertions finally catching up with her. "You understand now. More than money at stake." As Fritsch turned off the light and prepared to leave the room, Flena's voice stopped him once more. "Fritsch." "Yes, Grandma." "Roof still needs fixing. Tomorrow call Henderson Roofing, Gregory's cousin's boy. Give fair price." The practical reminder, delivered with the authority that occasionally broke through her post-stroke limitations, made Fritsch smile in the darkness. "I'll call first thing," he promised. That night, lying awake in his narrow bed, Fritsch contemplated the shifting foundations of his situation. He had come seeking security, but found purpose. He had expected burden, but discovered connection. The house that he had viewed as a potential asset had revealed itself as something more valuable, a physical embodiment of principles worth preserving. The realization didn't solve his immediate concerns, his dwindling savings, his interrupted career, the uncertainty of his professional future. But somehow, those anxieties seemed less overwhelming when placed alongside Flena's lifetime of purposeful choices. She had fought for what mattered, created something that would outlast her, and refused to surrender to practical pressures that contradicted her deepest values. Perhaps there were lessons here worth learning, Fritsch thought as he finally drifted toward sleep. Lessons about legacy, about meaningful work, about the courage to protect what deserves protection, even when doing so defies conventional wisdom. The Henderson who arrived to inspect the roof the following morning bore little resemblance to what Fritsch had expected from a cousin's boy. Harriet Henderson was a competent woman in her 50s who climbed the ladder with practiced ease, conducted a thorough examination of the damaged sections, and delivered a straightforward assessment as they stood in the driveway, reviewing her findings. "Main issue is around the chimney flashing," she explained, pointing to her detailed notes. "Water's getting in where the old seal has deteriorated. Secondary problem is along the north face, where you've got some shingle damage from winter storms. Could patch it, but given the age of the roof, I'd recommend a more comprehensive approach." Fritsch appreciated her professional clarity. What would that entail? Full replacement of the north face, new flashing around all penetrations, and targeted repairs to the remaining sections. She handed him a written estimate. Not cheap, but cheaper than waiting until you've got structural damage from continued water infiltration. The figure was significant, but not as astronomical as Fritsch had feared. Still, it would require accessing Flena's savings, a step he was hesitant to take without family consultation. "How long have you been in the roofing business?" he asked, stalling for time. Harriet smiled slightly. 30 years this June. Took over from my father when he retired. He worked with your grandfather on the original restoration of this place back in the 70s. "You knew my grandfather?" "Everyone knew Gregory Janandez," Harriet replied. "He taught science at the high school for nearly 3 decades. Half the town's adults passed through his classroom at one point or another, including me." She nodded toward the house. "How's Flena doing? Heard about the stroke?" "Better some days than others," Fritsch answered honestly. "We made it down to the beach yesterday." Harriet's expression softened. That would mean a lot to her. Those two were inseparable on the shore, always walking, collecting samples for Gregory's classes, documenting changes in the dune system. She paused, studying Fritsch with new interest. "You're the architect, right? Paula's boy?" Fritsch nodded, increasingly accustomed to being defined by his relationship to Flena rather than by his professional identity. "Good timing," Harriet continued. "The Heritage Committee's been looking for someone with architectural background to help evaluate some of the older buildings in town. Preservation grants available, but applications require professional assessments. Might be something to consider while you're here." Before Fritsch could respond, Flena appeared at the front door in her wheelchair, a determined set to her jaw. "Harriet Henderson," she called out with more strength than usual. "About time you showed up. Roof's been leaking since January storm." "Been a busy season, Flena." Harriet approached the porch with easy familiarity. "Everyone's calling after the winter we had. Your grandson here says you made it to the beach yesterday." "Man knows his ramps," Flena confirmed with a hint of pride that warmed Fritsch unexpectedly. The two women fell into conversation about local matters, who had weathered the winter well, whose properties had suffered damage, community projects planned for spring. Fritsch observed the interaction with interest, noting how engaged Flena became when discussing the town she had helped shape. Her speech remained affected by the stroke, but her determination to communicate overrode the limitations, resulting in shorter but clearer statements. When Harriet departed with a promise to schedule the roof work as soon as Fritsch confirmed the estimate, Flena turned to him with an expectant expression. "How bad?" she asked simply. Fritsch showed her the estimate. She studied it with a critical eye before nodding decisively. "Checkbook in desk, second drawer, write it now." "Shouldn't we discuss this with Mom and Uncle Martin first?" Fritsch suggested carefully. "It's a significant expense." Flena's expression hardened. "My house, my money, my decision." Each word was pronounced with deliberate clarity. Roof first, then talk. Recognizing the return of the formidable woman from the activist photographs, Fritsch yielded to her authority. He retrieved the checkbook, wrote the deposit amount specified in the estimate, and gave it to Flena to sign. Her signature was shakier than the bold script he remembered from childhood birthday cards, but it remained legally valid. "Good," she declared, handing back the signed check. "Now, Heritage Committee. What about it?" Fritsch asked, surprised she had overheard that part of his conversation with Harriet. "You should help," Flena stated, as if it were already decided. "Need work. They need architect. Perfect match." "It would probably be volunteer work," Fritsch pointed out. "I need paying clients if I'm going to rebuild my career." "Start somewhere," Flena countered. "Build reputation here. Work will follow." The suggestion was not what Fritsch had envisioned for his professional rehabilitation. He had imagined returning to Boston eventually, perhaps joining a smaller firm where he could have more design input, or even starting his own practice focusing on thoughtful urban renovations. The idea of establishing himself in Seabrook, with its seasonal economy and limited growth, seemed like a step backward. Yet, as the day progressed, the seed Flena had planted took root in his imagination. That afternoon, while she napped, Fritsch walked through the downtown area, seeing the historic buildings with fresh eyes. The colonial architecture, the repurposed fishing warehouses, the carefully maintained proportions of the main street, all spoke of intentional preservation that balanced aesthetic heritage with practical use. He found himself sketching ideas, how the abandoned sail loft could become studio apartments with minimal structural changes, how the crumbling harbormaster's office might be transformed into a visitor center that honored its maritime history, how strategic modifications could make century-old buildings accessible without compromising their essential character. When he returned home, he found Flena in the sunroom, a local newspaper spread across her lap, open to an article about the upcoming Heritage Festival in May. The annual event celebrated the town's history with historical reenactments, craft demonstrations and community displays, including the traditional quilt exhibition that had been part of the festival since its inception. "Need to finish my panel," Flena announced when she noticed him studying the article. "Hand-stitching. Annual tradition, 37 years. Is that a good idea with your limited mobility?" Fritsch asked, concerned that such fine motor work would frustrate her. The look she gave him could have frozen the Atlantic in August. "Not dead yet," she stated flatly. "Just damaged. Can adapt." Properly chastened, Fritsch helped her retrieve the quilting supplies from a cedar chest in the living room. The partially completed panel depicted the lighthouse that stood at the harbor entrance, rendered in varying shades of blue fabric against a background of white and cream. The precision of the work completed before her stroke was impressive. Continuing it with her reduced dexterity would be challenging, but not impossible. "Need frame adjusted," Flena explained, demonstrating how her current quilting frame required 2 functioning hands to operate. "Can you modify?" "I can try," Fritsch offered, studying the wooden frame's construction. "Maybe create a clamping system that requires less grip strength." For the next few hours they worked side by side in the sunroom as afternoon light streamed through the windows. Fritsch disassembled and redesigned the quilting frame, creating a system of levers and clamps that could be operated with minimal hand strength. Flena directed his work with precise instructions, occasionally demonstrating what she needed, with gestures when words failed her. The collaborative process felt surprisingly natural. Fritzsch's technical skills combined with Flener's practical knowledge created something neither could have achieved alone, a metaphor that wasn't lost on him as the adaptive frame took shape. By evening, the modified frame was complete, allowing Flener to resume her quilting with her functioning right hand. Her stitches were slower and less uniform than before, but she worked with determined concentration, adapting her technique to her new limitations. Gregory always said, she commented as she secured a particularly challenging seam, "Problem not obstacle. Just needs new approach. Sounds like something an architect needs to remember," Fritsch replied, watching her methodical progress. "Exactly." She looked up from her work, meeting his eyes directly. "Not giving up festival. Been part every year. Since 1988, Stroke doesn't change that." Her determination was both inspiring and concerning. The festival was still 2 months away, but Flener's rehabilitation progressed slowly. Her left side remained largely unresponsive, her speech improved but still limited, and her stamina quickly depleted by physical or emotional exertion. Yet Fritsch found himself reluctant to discourage her goal. Perhaps having a concrete objective, a deadline, a public commitment, provided motivation that abstract therapy goals couldn't match. And if her quilt panel wasn't perfect, wouldn't the attempt itself represent exactly the kind of resilience the community celebration was meant to honor? "We'll make it happen," he promised, surprising himself with his certainty. "Whatever adaptations you need." That night, after helping Flener to bed, Fritsch returned to the sunroom and opened his laptop. Instead of searching job listings in Boston, as had become his evening ritual, he researched the Heritage Committee Harriet had mentioned. The group met weekly at the town library, with their next meeting scheduled for the following evening. It would be simple enough to attend, to introduce himself and offer his professional expertise for their building assessments. The work might not advance his career in the way he had originally planned, but it would keep his skills sharp, forge connections in the community, and perhaps most importantly, make constructive use of the time he had committed to remaining in Seabrook. As he closed his laptop, Fritsch noticed Flener's quilting project still set up on the modified frame. In the stillness of the house, with only the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway for company, he allowed himself to acknowledge a subtle but significant shift in his perspective. He had come to Seabrook focusing on what he was sacrificing by being here. Increasingly, he found himself considering what he might gain, what he might build, in this unexpected chapter of his life. The thought was still forming, still tentative, when his phone chimed with a notification. A former colleague had posted photos of the groundbreaking ceremony for a major development in Boston, a project Fritsch had contributed to in its initial phases before leaving the firm. The sleek glass tower rising from the demolished remains of a historic neighborhood represented everything he had been trained to value: innovation, progress, prominence. Yet now, looking at the digital rendering superimposed over the construction site, Fritsch felt an unfamiliar ambivalence. The design was impressive but somehow disconnected from the human lives it would contain and affect. He thought of Flener's weathered house, with its creaking floors and stubborn character, its connections to both personal and community history. There was a richness there that couldn't be engineered into new construction, a depth that came only with time and lived experience. Perhaps there was a middle path in architecture that honored heritage while embracing necessary change. Preservation not as a museum-like freezing of the past, but as thoughtful stewardship of valuable human continuity. It was the kind of philosophy that would have little currency in the competitive Boston firms, but might find appreciation in a community that had fought to maintain its essential character against economic pressures. As Fritsch prepared for bed, he realized with mild surprise that he had spent the entire evening without calculating how many days remained until Flener's medical reassessment. The arbitrary deadline that had once represented his escape from caregiving, obligations now seemed less significant than the work, both personal and professional, that he had begun to envision beyond it. Will the upcoming Heritage Festival bring new opportunities for both Fritsch and Flener? And as Fritsch begins to see value in the community's preservation efforts, will he find a new direction for his architectural aspirations? The journey continues to reveal unexpected possibilities. April arrived with gentler temperatures and the first tentative blossoms in Flena's neglected garden. The week since the roof repair had settled into a rhythm: morning medical routines and therapy exercises, afternoon projects that increasingly involved both practical caregiving and creative collaboration, evening meetings with the Heritage Committee that had welcomed Fritsch's architectural expertise with enthusiasm. His first presentation to the committee, a thorough assessment of the structural needs of the old customs house, with recommendations for historically appropriate accessibility modifications, had led to a modest consulting contract funded by a preservation grant. The work wasn't financially substantial, but it provided professional validation and a reason to engage with the community beyond his role as Flena's caretaker. More surprising was how quickly Seabrook had begun to feel familiar. The quiet mornings with fog rolling off the water, the predictable patterns of the tides, the gradual recognition from shopkeepers and neighbors who no longer treated him as a visitor, but as a resident with connections and purpose. He had even begun attending Tofia's monthly lecture series at the library, finding unexpected intellectual stimulation in her incisive analyses of environmental literature and its connections to local history. This particular morning, Fritzsche helped Flena into the car for her monthly neurologist appointment in the neighboring larger town. These medical visits typically left her exhausted and frustrated, highlighting the limitations of her recovery despite incremental progress. Today's assessment would be particularly significant: the 3-month mark since her stroke, a point at which long-term prognosis became clearer. "Nervous?" Fritsch asked as they drove along the coastal road, the ocean occasionally visible between the sprouting spring foliage. "Realistic," Flena replied, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Her speech had improved considerably, though she still relied on abbreviated sentences and occasionally struggled to find specific words. "No limits now. Won't be like before." The quiet acceptance in her tone was new. In earlier weeks, she had approached each therapy session with fierce determination to overcome her body's betrayal, pushing until exhaustion or tears overwhelmed her. The shift toward pragmatism represented either growing wisdom or dangerous resignation. Fritsch wasn't sure which. The neurology clinic was busy, the waiting room filled with patients of various ages in different stages of recovery, from strokes, head injuries, and neurological conditions. Fritsch observed Flena's reaction as she took in the scene, her back straightening slightly, her expression becoming more composed, as if unwilling to display vulnerability among fellow survivors. When they were finally called in, Dr. Mercer greeted them with professional warmth. After examining Flena and reviewing her therapy reports, she sat across from them with an air of cautious optimism. "The progress is measurable," she confirmed, pointing to specific metrics in the file. "Your speech fluency has improved significantly. Fine motor control in your right hand shows excellent recovery. The persistent left side weakness remains our primary concern, but even there we're seeing small gains in the shoulder and upper arm." "Walking?" Flena asked directly, naming her greatest frustration. Despite intensive physical therapy, her ability to ambulate independently remained severely limited, confining her primarily to the wheelchair, with occasional short distances using a walker under supervision. Dr. Mercer's expression shifted to one of measured caution. "I believe you'll continue to make gains with gait and balance, but I want to be realistic about expectations. Many stroke survivors at your age find that a combination of mobility aids, wheelchair for longer distances, walker for household movement, becomes their new normal." Flena absorbed this assessment with a small nod, her face revealing little. "Hands more important than feet," she stated with practical clarity. "Need hands for quilting." The doctor smiled at this prioritization. "In that case, we should emphasize occupational therapy, focusing on fine motor skills. I'll adjust your prescription accordingly." She made notes in the file before addressing both of them. "Overall, I'm pleased with your recovery trajectory. Many patients show their most dramatic improvements in the first 3 months, but that doesn't mean progress stops. It often continues at a slower pace for a year or more." As they left the clinic, Fritsch studied his grandmother's expression, trying to gauge her reaction to this mixed prognosis. "Are you disappointed?" he asked gently as he helped her into the car. Flena considered the question with uncharacteristic patience. "Yes," she admitted finally, "and no, alive, thinking clearly, can still fight for what matters." She gestured toward her immobile left leg. "This doesn't define me." The simple declaration carried the weight of a philosophy earned through decades of activism and personal challenges. Fritsch found himself nodding in agreement, recognizing that Flena's true strength had never been primarily physical. Instead of driving directly home, Fritsch took an impulsive detour toward downtown Seabrook. "I want to show you something," he explained, as Flena raised questioning eyebrows. He parked near the harbor and helped Flena into her wheelchair, navigating the recently installed accessible walkway that curved along the waterfront. They stopped before a modest brick building with arched windows and a slate roof, the former harbormaster's office that Fritsch had been assessing for the Heritage Committee. "This is my first real project here," he explained, positioning her. "Wheelchair for an optimal view. The committee approved my design proposal yesterday. We'll restore the exterior completely while adapting the interior as a community welcome center and maritime museum." Flena studied the building with experienced eyes, noting the architectural details that marked its 19th century origins. "Good bones," she approved. "Important building deserves saving." "That's what I thought," Fritsch agreed, surprised by how much her validation meant to him. "We'll preserve all the key historical elements while making it fully accessible. Universal, design principles throughout, so everyone can experience it regardless of physical limitations." As he described his vision for the space, how the adaptive features would be integrated seamlessly rather than appearing as afterthoughts, how the historical narrative would be honored while creating new functionality, Fritsch realized he was speaking with a passion that had been absent from his professional vocabulary for years. Somewhere between caring for Flena and engaging with Seabrook's architectural heritage, he had reconnected with the core values that had drawn him to architecture. Initially, creating spaces that served human needs while respecting historical and environmental contexts. "When do you start?" Flena asked, clearly noting his enthusiasm. "Construction begins next month. I'll be overseeing the project while continuing your care." He hesitated before adding, "If that's still what you want." Flena tilted her head, studying him with penetrating eyes. "Question is what you want now. Original plan was temporary. Medical reassessment deadline approaching." The directness of her observation caught Fritsch off guard. He had assumed his internal shift wasn't obvious to others, yet Flena had clearly sensed the evolution in his attitude toward remaining in Seabrook. The impending 6-month assessment date, once a finish line he'd been racing toward, now represented a different kind of threshold. Before he could formulate a response, a commotion near the harbor drew their attention. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights had arrived at the marina, and a crowd was gathering along the promenade. Fritsch wheeled. Flena closer to investigate. "Boat fire," explained a bystander. "Old fishing trawler, no one aboard, thankfully." They watched as firefighters contained the blaze on a weathered vessel that had been docked at the harbor's edge. The acrid smell of burning fuel and fiberglass carried on the breeze, causing Flena to cover her mouth and nose with her scarf. "Should get you home," Fritsch suggested, concerned about the air quality's effect on her already compromised health. As he turned the wheelchair to leave, a tall figure stepped into their path. Tophia Jenkins regarded them with her characteristic, analytical gaze, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. "Quite the excitement for our sleepy harbor," she commented, nodding toward the smoldering boat. "Fortunate timing that the fire brigade was conducting a training exercise just 2 blocks away." "Were you at the library?" Fritsch asked, noting her satchel filled with books. Her research for next month's lecture series, Maritime Disasters in Literature and Their Environmental Implications. Her attention shifted to Flena. "How was your medical assessment?" "Realistic," Flena replied, using the same term she had with Fritsch earlier. "Progress continues, limitations remain. The essence of the human condition," Tophia observed with philosophical precision. Then, to Fritsch's surprise, she addressed him directly. "The Heritage Committee is quite impressed with your Harbour Master Office proposal. Rare to find someone who understands both structural integrity and historical significance." "Thank you," Fritsch responded, unused to such direct professional acknowledgement. "It's a meaningful project." "Indeed." Tofia's eyes held his with unexpected intensity. Though one wonders why an architect trained in contemporary urban design would find satisfaction in restoring a modest maritime building in a small coastal town. The question hung between them, more challenge than curiosity. Before Fritsch could formulate a defensive response, Flena interjected. "Growth," she stated simply. "Finding what matters." Tofia's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps." She adjusted her satchel. "In any case, the Historical Society Board meets tomorrow evening to review grant applications for the fall cycle. Your Harbour Master project will be discussed as a potential template for future restorations. 7 o'clock at the Society headquarters, should you wish to attend." With that cryptic invitation, she continued on her way, her tall figure soon disappearing around the harbour curve. "She suspects your motives," Flena observed once Tofia was out of earshot. "Always has." "So I've noticed," Fritsch agreed, resuming their journey toward the car. "Though I'm not sure what motives she thinks I have anymore. I'm hardly positioning myself for some grand inheritance." The words emerged more bitterly than he'd intended, revealing a lingering resentment about the financial realities he'd discovered in Flena's attic. He immediately regretted the comment, but Flena merely nodded with equanimity. "Tofia sees patterns," she explained. "Watched many summer people come, take what they want from town, leave when convenient." "Is that what you think I'm doing?" Fritsch asked, suddenly needing to know how his grandmother perceived his evolving relationship with Seabrook. Flena considered her answer carefully. "Not anymore," she finally stated. "Changed, both changed." The simple observation contained profound truth. As Fritsch helped Flena into the car, he reflected on the unexpected transformation of their arrangement. What had begun as a calculated decision, sacrificing months of his life for presumed financial security, had evolved into something far more complex. He was no longer simply Flena's caretaker, nor was she merely his dependent. They had become collaborative participants in a shared life, each contributing what they could to the other's well-being. That evening, as a spring storm rolled in from the Atlantic, bringing wind and rain that tested the newly repaired roof, Fritsch received an email that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their story. Westridge Partners, a prestigious Boston architectural firm known for innovative urban projects, had reviewed his portfolio and expressed interest in scheduling an interview. The position offered exactly what Fritsch had been seeking before Flena's stroke: creative autonomy, professional recognition, financial security. His first instinct was unalloyed excitement. This was the opportunity he had been working toward throughout his career, the validation of his talent and training. He began composing an enthusiastic response, suggesting interview dates after Flena's 6-month assessment. Then his fingers paused over the keyboard. The timing was what he had originally planned. Return to Boston after his obligation to Flena was fulfilled. Yet the thought of leaving Seabrook now, with the Harbour Master project just beginning and his integration into the community deepening, created an unexpected sense of loss. More unsettling was the realization that he no longer viewed caring for Flena primarily as an obligation. Their relationship had transcended the transactional calculation that had initially brought him to her home. She had become not just his grandmother, but his mentor, his critic, his collaborator. The thought of transferring her care to professionals or assisted living staff, even with frequent visits from family, felt increasingly wrong. As the storm intensified outside, Fritsch heard Flena's voice calling from her bedroom. He found her awake, troubled by the winds howling reminiscent of hurricanes she had weathered in this house over decades. "Roof holding?" she asked as he checked her window latches. "Henderson does good work," he assured her. "Everything's secure." Rather than returning to his email, Fritsch sat in the chair beside her bed, listening to the storm with her. In the dim light, with rain lashing against the windows, Flena's face appeared both vulnerable and indomitable, a woman who had faced countless literal and metaphorical storms without surrendering. "Got news," she said unexpectedly, proving, Once again, her uncanny ability to read his thoughts. Something happened. Saw it in your face at dinner. Fritsch hesitated only briefly before sharing the email from Westridge Partners. It's the kind of opportunity I've been working toward for years, he explained. Prestigious firm, innovative projects, good compensation. In Boston, Flena added, naming the unspoken complication. Yes. The single word hung between them, laden with implications. For a moment, only the storm's voice filled the silence. Should go, Flena finally said, her tone neutral but her eyes revealing more complex emotions. Always meant to be temporary arrangement. Your life waiting. It's not that simple anymore, Fritsch admitted. There's the Harbour Master project, the Heritage Committee work. And you, managing better now, she interrupted. Could have home health aide increase hours, maybe part-time nurse. The practical solution she offered was reasonable, yet somehow hollow. Fritsch tried to imagine returning to Boston, to the competitive architectural world he had once navigated, with single-minded ambition. The sleek high-rises and cutting-edge designs that had once represented success now seemed strangely disconnected from the architectural values he had been rediscovering in Seabrook. I need to think about it, he said finally. It's not a decision to rush. Flena nodded, accepting his uncertainty. Life rarely follows blueprints, she observed with the wisdom earned through decades of activism and adaptation, sometimes better for it. As if punctuating her statement, a tremendous crash sounded from the yard, a tree branch breaking under the storm's assault. Fritsch rushed to the window to assess the damage, but could see little through the rain-lashed darkness. We'll check in the morning, he assured Flena, helping her settle back against her pillows. Try to sleep now, I'll stay until the storm passes. He remained in the chair beside her bed, until her breathing deepened into sleep. The email from Westridge Partners still unanswered on his laptop. The storm raged on, powerful and transformative, much like the internal forces reshaping his understanding of success, commitment, and purpose. In that moment of watching over his grandmother's sleep, while wind and rain battered the house they shared, Fritsch realized that the turning point in his journey had arrived unexpectedly, not as a calculated decision but as a gradual transformation that had been occurring daily in small accumulated moments of connection and purpose. The interview offer from Westridge Partners wasn't just a professional opportunity. It was a crossroads demanding clarity about what truly mattered in the architecture of a meaningful life. The morning after the storm found Fritsch and Flena stepping carefully through the debris in the yard. Broken branches lay scattered across the lawn, and a fallen beam from the fence marked where the wind had been strongest. As he cleared a path to the driveway, Flena watched from the porch, offering precise instructions about which shrubs to save and which could be sacrificed to the storm's fury. In every snapped twig and flung flower pot, Fritsch saw both the power of nature and the resilience of this house he'd come to protect. By midday, the neighbors arrived, Harriet with tools for repairing the fence, Vera bearing coffee and fresh muffins, Tofia offering philosophical commentary on impermanence. Together, they set to work. Flena's laughter, rare and sweet, since the stroke rang out as she supervised, reminding Fritsch that community was as vital as the structure of the house itself. When the last branch was loaded into a neighbor's truck, he felt a renewed sense of belonging, as though the house belonged, as much to him now as it did to Flena. In the days that followed, the rhythm of life settled into a comfortable routine. Fritsch continued his work with the Heritage Committee, drafting plans for the old customs house and meeting local craftsmen to discuss historically sympathetic materials. Flena resumed her weekly quilting sessions with Harriet and Tofia, the modified frame, allowing her to stitch the lighthouse panel with painstaking grace. The trio of friends clustered in the sunroom each morning. Vera brewed tea, Harriet read aloud from local archives, and Flena added new stitches that told stories of shorelines saved. Fritsch watched their hands move in unison, one turning pages, one dealing cards, one guiding needle and thread, and recognized that every act of preservation, whether of buildings or traditions, required a gathering of hearts. Yet beneath this serenity lay the unfinished business of Fritsch's former life. The email from Westridge Partners remained unanswered in his inbox, its promise of creative autonomy and financial security clashing with his growing attachment to Seabrook. One evening, after helping Flena settle into bed, he sat at his laptop in the guest room and drafted a reply that balanced gratitude with uncertainty. "Thank you for the opportunity. I am deeply honored by your interest and would welcome an interview. However, I have ongoing commitments in Seabrook related to both family care and community restoration projects. Would it be possible to discuss flexible arrangements or a remote role that could accommodate my responsibilities here?" He paused before sending heart-pounding, then clicked send and leaned back, bracing himself for whatever reply might come. Meanwhile, Paula and Martin descended on Seabrook for a family council. Their drive down the coastal road had been tense, Paula fretting over Flena's care plan, and Martin calculating potential sales of the property. Fritsch led them through the house, pointing out the accessibility modifications, the repaired roof, the quilting frame in the sunroom. They saw how Flena's spirits brightened among her quilting circle, how the community rallied around her, and how Fritsch had become not just a caretaker, but a community advocate. Over coffee in the kitchen, Paula admitted that her initial plan to sell the house now felt rushed, as though she had tried to reduce their grandmother's life to a balance sheet. Martin, ever the pragmatist, conceded that the conservation trust Flena had placed on the property effectively ruled out a sale anyway. The siblings agreed to support increased home health aid hours and to explore funding streams through grants and local non-profits. As they drove away, Fritsch realized that the family's unity, strained for so long, had begun to mend. With the family's blessing secured, Fritsch negotiated with a local nursing agency to provide additional in-home care. A registered nurse arrived twice weekly to assist with more complex therapies, allowing him to focus on his architectural work and on ensuring that Flena never felt abandoned when he was at meetings. In return, he committed to overseeing the restoration of 2 historic buildings, a small stipend that, while modest, represented the first steady income he'd had since leaving Boston. Each morning as he left the house, he felt the thrill of purpose rather than duty, the joy of collaboration rather than obligation. Spring arrived in earnest as preparations for the Heritage Festival accelerated. Fritsch helped erect informational panels in the sunroom, displaying before and after renderings of the Customs House, historical photographs of Flena's activism, and excerpts from her journals. On the morning of the festival, he wheeled her into the room, her quilted lighthouse, panel hanging proudly above her. Neighbors, committee members, and passers-by paused to congratulate both of them. Tofia introduced Flena to the mayor, and Vera pressed a plate of lemon squares into her hand. Fritsch watched his grandmother's face glow with something between pride and astonishment. When the ribbon was cut, banner overhead proclaiming Seabrook Heritage Festival, honoring our past, inspiring our future, Flena squeezed his hand and whispered, "Worth every stitch." Amid the festival's bustle, Fritsch's phone buzzed, with the awaited reply from Westridge Partners. He excused himself behind a pop-up tent and read their response. "We admire your dedication and believe in flexible collaboration. Let's schedule a virtual interview, and we can discuss part-time remote involvement that honors your commitments." His chest tightened with relief and excitement. Seabrook had offered him purpose. Boston offered acclaim. Now for the first time they seemed compatible. He returned to Flena's side just as she guided a local reporter through her advocacy story. The reporter asked what advice she'd give to younger generations. Flena responded with her trademark directness. "Fight for what matters. Protect what you love. Adapt when the world changes without losing your soul." The crowd applauded, and Fritsch realized that those words applied to him now more than ever. That evening, as the festival lights dimmed and the last lantern floated on the restored fountain, Fritsch helped Flena back to her wheelchair. The scent of salt air still clung to the benches along the shore. He took her hand and rolled her toward the water's edge for one last view under the full moon. Fireflies danced in the grasses, and the ocean whispered a familiar lullaby. Flena closed her eyes, a soft smile curving her lips. "It's been a good day," she murmured. "It's been perfect," Fritsch replied. They lingered in companionable silence. the rhythmic pulse of the waves echoing in their chests. In the weeks that followed, Fritzsch's hybrid arrangement took shape. He conducted remote design meetings early in the morning, then attended local construction check-ins and therapy sessions in the afternoons. Westridge Partners sent a small team up to Seabrook to collaborate on urban projects, and Fritzsch discovered that even a small community could benefit from the kind of thoughtful design he had once believed only big cities could afford. His portfolio grew richer, with images of porch ramps that doubled as community gathering spots, of historic warehouses repurposed as artist studios, of coastal trails that invited both locals and visitors to savor the same views his grandparents had fought to protect. Flena's health continued to improve incrementally. Her left arm regained more strength, her speech grew nearly fluid, and her quilting stitches became finer and more confident. She planted a new rosebush by the front steps, tending it with the same fierce dedication she had once reserved for town council battles. On warm afternoons, the sunroom filled with the gentle hum of the sewing machine she had insisted on installing, and Fritzsch often found himself drafting plans for a small on-site education center where visitors could learn about coastal ecology and preservation, an idea inspired directly by Flena's lifelong activism. One breezy morning, as they watched a group of schoolchildren exploring the shoreline under a visiting environmental scientist's guidance, Flena turned to Fritzsch and said, "Legacy isn't about lines on a ledger. It's about seeds planted, stories told, and lives changed." Fritzsch nodded, his heart full. He realized that in choosing to stay, he had rediscovered not only his architectural calling, but also a deeper connection to family, community, and purpose. The inheritance he had once coveted, money, property, security, paled in comparison to the legacy he was helping to build alongside his grandmother. Later that day, Fritzsch drafted the final chapter of his professional story, a comprehensive proposal for a living history center in the old customs house, leveraging grants from the Heritage Committee and remote support from his Boston colleagues. He emailed it to the committee and to Westridge Partners, confident that this hybrid model would not only preserve Seabrook's heritage, but also showcase a pioneering approach to community-centered design. When he delivered the printed copies to Flena in the sunroom, she patted his shoulder and said, "You've come a long way, child." Fritzsch looked at the document, his hand-drawn sketches, annotated budgets, and heartfelt narrative about intergenerational partnership, and replied, "We've come a long way, Grandma." As the evening sunlight slanted through the bay window, illuminating the quilted lighthouse and the original protest petition displayed on the wall, Fritzsch understood that some stories didn't end. They evolved. And in the chapters yet unwritten, he and Flena would continue to protect, preserve, and build together. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.